Welcome to this presentation. Today we're going to talk primarily about question marks, but we're also going to talk about dashes and parentheticals. So let's get started. If you have the red 4th edition book, the Aspen Handbook, we will be starting on page 53. So if you would go ahead and get that book out. If you have the green 3rd edition, we will be on page starting on page 50. I think it's easier if you follow along. Also take careful notes. If you want to write in your book, certainly write in the book or take notes separately, so you don't have to commit things to memory, but you'll have a resource that you can use as you are doing assignments, because these lectures are designed to be actionable material for both your document assignments as well as your grammar proofreading assignments. So let's begin. Quotation marks are generally not a big problem, but there is one thing that students commonly miss. And so I'm mainly making this presentation to cover that point. But let's talk generally about them for a second. One thing to keep in mind is there are two types of question marks. I'm sorry, I'm saying question marks. I mean quotation marks. One are the doubles, where there are two little dashes, and there are the single forms, the one line. I'll be honest with you, we aren't going to do a deep enough dive into question marks to even cover the single line quotation marks. So all the quotation marks that you'll be using in this course will be the double line variety. So that's just a little helpful hint for you from that perspective. Okay, so let's talk about when do we use quotation marks, and it's when we are taking an exact quote. If we're paraphrasing, summarizing, putting in our own words something that somebody else has said, we don't put them in quotes, because when you put them in quotes, we're saying this is verbatim, word for word, what this person said. If you see something in quotes on an assignment, that means I should not tinker with it. We don't correct grammar in quotes. We don't change punctuations in quotes. We don't make a quote that was in passive voice into active voice. Actually, it's easier for us. It's one part of the assignment we really don't have to worry too much about. I suppose you could remove the quotation marks and paraphrase it, but I rarely have students who try that. What commonly happens is that the student will either keep the quotation marks and correct the grammar. In other words, now they're misquoting the person, or they will remove the quotation marks and correct the grammar, but not do anything beyond some minimal correction. And so now they're not attributing to the speaker or the writer exactly what was said, and we don't want to do either one of those things. Those raise ethical issues. So my advice to you would be hands off what's in the quotes. Just treat that as sacrosanct, something you can't change. So when we use the quotation marks, we're using the exact words of the speaker or the writer. We also use it to emphasize a particular word. And oftentimes it's when we use the word not with its ordinary meaning, but we're using it for some other purpose. So we can see here in this sentence, the author misspelled the word appellate in the brief. Putting in quotation marks makes it easier for the reader to understand what is being said. That we don't mean appellant, we don't mean the word, we don't mean the idea behind the word, we mean literally this combination of letters on a piece of paper. And then here we have the words its and its are often confused. Okay, so again, it would be difficult for us to follow this sentence if we hadn't put these in quotation marks. So that's really what we're doing with the quotation marks. We're making it easier to understand. This function is optional. You don't have to do this second one if you don't want to. This first one isn't. This one is optional, but it certainly makes for a nicer, cleaner, clearer passage. For this class, you won't ever have to do this one. In fact, I can't think of any examples where you'd even have the option of doing this one. And again, we're not going to talk about single quotes, so let's go forward. Okay, let's talk about indirect quotes for a second, because this is definitely a thing that sometimes people get confused about. In our example up here, we had a direct verbatim quote. You may recall from history class, Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty," or "Give me death." That is a direct quote, but we could also make it an indirect or a paraphrase quote. So a way we could paraphrase that would be, Patrick Henry made a statement regarding liberty and death. Or Patrick Henry said that he preferred to die than to lose his liberty. So I have summarized, I have paraphrased his words. Well, when I do that, I don't put them in quotes. That's what we oftentimes call an indirect quote. So let's look at some examples of indirect quotes. Upon entering the courtroom, the judge said that she expected silence from the spectators. The word "that" is our signal that we don't have a direct quote. This is summarizing what she said. She might have started by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is an important hearing. I expect that all the rules of decorum are followed, and I don't want to hear a sound from anybody other than the attorneys, the witnesses, and myself." That might be how she might have said that. The gist of it is summarized here. But when we say that and when we don't put it in quotes, we're communicating, hey, I'm not saying she said these exact words, okay? Here's another way that the same idea could have been conveyed, but now we're using a quote. Upon entering the courtroom, the judge said, "I expect silence from the spectators." These are her exact words. You notice that the word "that" is no longer here, and we have quotations around the words that were actually stated. Let's look at what's incorrect here. There's a few problems with this incorrect quote. We have the word "that," which signals us, hey, this is going to be an indirect quote, not verbatim. And then we have quotation marks, "that," okay? Another problem is that we need to have a comma after the "said." Well, that should go away, then we need to have a comma here. That's when the signals, we'll talk about this when we get to the comma section, but that's when the signals that a quote is coming up. That's one of the signals to the reader. And because this is a complete sentence, actually, in this case, we shouldn't say "she" here, we should say "I," because obviously she didn't refer to herself from the bench and saying she expected silence from the spectators. She would have said, "I," meaning the judge, expect silence from the spectators. So we have the wrong verb here, but since this would be a complete sentence, we also need to capitalize it. So let's look at this one for an in and out of how we do this, okay? When we have our signal, our question signal, it can be said, says, asked, asks, state, states. I mean, there's lots of different signals that we have here. And it is the lead-in, and in other words, it comes before the quote. We're going to put a comma here. We're going to do a space. We're going to have open quotes. Then we're going to capitalize the first letter. In this case, obviously, we always capitalize I, but even if it weren't, we would capitalize it if the rest of it is a complete sentence. Then we're going to put our period or question mark or exclamation point or whatever's punctuation we have within the quotations and then close the quotations. This is the important thing. I have relatively few students who make any mistakes other than this one. I'd say about 20 to 30% of students will put the period outside of the quotation marks. They'll get everything else right. Sometimes they won't capitalize the first word, but most of the time they'll get everything else right, but they'll miss this. I think the reason that some students miss this is that in other cultures, the period goes outside the quotations. I've read that in Great Britain, they do it outside the quotations. There may be other countries where that's done. And so if you've gotten used to that, or if you've read books or newspapers or magazines from other parts of the world where that is how punctuation is done, that may look right to you. So you may have to kind of unlearn that. But we put terminal punctuation within the quotation marks. And this could be a period, exclamation point, or a question mark. Okay, we already talked though in another lecture that we put colons and semicolons outside. I always hesitate whether to talk about this because really it's very rare that you would have a colon or a semicolon here. It could happen, it's not impossible, but it's pretty rare. And so by giving you that additional rule, I'm concerned it's going to confuse you about the important rule. This is the important one. Terminal punctuation within the quotation. So if you can't remember the colon and semicolon rule, that's okay. You really need to remember this one. This is the one, if you forget, you are going to be giving up several points in this course. So commit this one to memory, or more importantly, just look it up because this is all look upable as you are doing assignments. Okay, sorry about that. Make sure everything going well. Okay, now you see there's additional rules for when you don't start with the signal. Patrick Henry said, comma, space, quote, capital G, give me liberty or give me death, period, close quotes, then a space for the next sentence. You can actually have the signal appear in the middle of the sentence, or you can have it appear at the end. I'm not going to go through all those rules. Just know there are examples. You don't need to wing this. In fact, you shouldn't wing this. There are very specific rules about this. You veer from it by adding too many spaces or putting something in the wrong place or forgetting to capitalize it. Points are going to go away. So be sure you're getting this correctly. It's not correct. It's not hard to. You just have to refer to your book and do your notes. And you might want to even dog ear page 53 or 54 so you'll have this ready for you. Let's look at, so sometimes though you don't take a complete quote from a document. You just take a snippet, a phrase, even a word or two. In that case, you're not going to capitalize the first word of that particular quote. Here we have the judge said the error would be reversed due to clear error. This obviously isn't a sentence, so we're not going to capitalize the C here. But when we get that whole sentence, when we're doing a whole sentence, we're going to have to follow all of these rigmarole. Let me get rid of the, I don't know if I can. Okay, may not be able to. We're going to have our signal. In this case, we're using said, comma, space, open quotes, capital letter, at the end of our sentence, period, close quotes. But here, when we're just doing the snippet, we're not going to have a comma, we're just going to have a space, open quotes, lowercase letter. Because this whole sentence ends, we're going to put a period right there. If this were in the middle of the sentence, if we had clear error in the middle of a sentence, to say the judge said the judgment would be reversed due to clear error and he was wrong, period. We wouldn't put a period here. The only reason we have a period is because the whole sentence is over. But even though this period relates to the whole sentence and it doesn't really relate independently to this clear error part, we still put the period within the quotation marks. Now you may think to yourself, well, that's not logical. I mean, it makes sense to put the period in the quotation marks when you actually have a complete sentence in the quotation marks, but here it doesn't make sense. I don't disagree with you. You raise a very valid point. But the rule is a rule, and so we're going to follow it. And in defense of the rule, I would say this. It's nice to have just a clean rule. Always put terminal punctuation in the quotation marks. That way, you can almost be an automatic pilot. You don't have to consider whether it is a complete sentence within that quotation marks or whether it's just a snippet of a sentence. Okay? So, to review, periods and commas and usually question marks and exclamation parts are going to go within the quotations. Semicolons and colons are not going to go within the quotation marks. And then here are again some more examples about how to do those quotations. We don't have to worry about single or double quotes in this particular case. You'll see on page 55 of the Red Book, there's a series of instructions about how to handle quotations. This is a really, really important topic in legal research. It is not an important topic in this course, and I refuse to make it an important topic. It's very nitpicky, and we don't have blue books in this particular course. So this is a rather nice and accurate summary of blue book rules, but because we're not doing it, I'm not going to expect for you to know the blue book rules. So don't worry about this. But if you're taking legal research or legal writing, these rules would apply in those courses, and they certainly are relevant to your practice life. So it's useful information. It's just not information that we need for this particular class. All right, so we are done with the quotation marks. I'm going to briefly talk about a few other issues before we close this lecture down. Let's talk about parentheses. We all know what a parenthesis is. It's the kind of eyebrow. A lot of times we use this if we're doing emoticons to make a face or something along those lines. These are, when we even talk about parenthesis, we're talking about kind of an interruption, kind of an aside, or an FYI. It's not essential to the meaning of the sentence. It's kind of a, by the way, nice to know type of thing. If you don't want to use parentheticals, I don't think, well, as a general rule, you don't have to use them. There are a few Blue Book times where you have to use them, but generally, at least for the actual content of the document, you don't have to use them. There are other tools to do that. For one thing, you could just make a separate sentence after the main sentence that talks about whatever that parenthetical issue is, or you could use it as its own clause. You have to be a little tricky. It's a little tricky to write that sometimes, but you can usually set it off with commas. Or you could drop a footnote. Or if it really is kind of a nice to know fact but not essential, you might decide you don't even need to talk about it. So parentheticals aren't a required means, but they can be useful from time to time. One of the challenges with parentheticals is that you don't want to, because really what you're doing is it's almost as if the reader is hearing two voices. He's in the middle of a sentence and now you're telling him something else. Oh, by the way, I want to tell you about this. But I was in the middle of the sentence learning about fact A and now you're telling me about fact B. It's multitasking and readers aren't that good at that, to be honest with you. So you are, by dividing the reader's attention, you are somewhat shooting yourself in the own foot. So I would not recommend that you do parentheticals very often, and I would encourage you, if you choose to do it, to keep your parentheticals very, very short. Okay, they are a little bit informal, and so again, that's another reason not to abuse them in legal writing. Let's look at some situations where you might use parentheticals. To set off interruptions, so here we have his primary argument was res ipsa loquitur. That's a Latin expression meaning the thing speaks for itself. And you can see how this is a nice little detail if a person doesn't know what res ipsa loquitur means. But it could have also been accomplished by not putting in parentheses, just putting a comma here, and this then becomes in a positive. Either way would be fine. To do. So usually if you're doing a interruption, explanation, or translation, setting off with commas will also work if it's not a complete sentence. And you can see a nice thing about this one is that it is appearing at the end of the sentence, so it's less of an interruption. You've already said the main point and now you're going to this little aside point. To direct the reader to other information, this is very common, and sometimes you have to do this in terms of blue booking and citing, say, in appellate briefs. Where I'm the judge, you are saying that the plaintiff failed to allege materiality in the fraud cause of action. Well, tell me where. Well, prove that to me. Oh, okay, I can find it in complaint paragraph 14. Or I can find it's not there in complaint paragraph 14. Okay, so now I'm going to flip over to that. Oh yeah, you're right, it's not there. Okay, so that is what it's telling me where to find that particular information. Sometimes citations like this are in parentheticals, sometimes they're not. You'd have to look at the local rules to see whether you need to do that or not. This one is pretty close to a necessary thing. You will actually do this pretty often, not in this class, but in other classes. And this is where you have a defined term. In this particular one, let's say that we are the plaintiff and we are submitting our complaint. Well, we're describing ourselves. The plaintiff, and the name of the plaintiff is Southwest Avionics Industries. But you know what? That's a really long name. We don't want to type that like 400 times in this document. And so we've decided to, going forward, not call ourselves plaintiff or not call ourselves Southwest Avionics Industries, at least not do it all the time, but instead call ourselves SAI. It's just easier, takes up less space. And of course, many times in legal writing, you're up against a page limit. And so any way you can keep the number of letters smaller is a good thing. So here, the way that you do this, how you define the term, is you have the term that you want to define, and then you open parens, you put it in quotations, the way that you're going to define it going forward, and then typically it's going to be significantly shorter, obviously, because this is what you're going to be using instead of this longer expression. You close the quote, you close the parentheses, and you're ready to go. And so going forward, whenever you type in SAI, obviously you're going to capitalize it because that's the signal that, hey, this is that defined term I already talked about. But when you talk about the future, you don't have to put it in parentheses. You shouldn't put it in parentheses, actually, and you shouldn't put it in quotation marks. Okay. Another common thing to do, this is this last one is especially common in documents that have a legal force that create legal rights or change legal rights. For example, a contract or a will. Obviously, one of the things that can happen, especially in a long document when there's revisions and there's lots of different people typing them and things like that, is that there can be typos. And you'd hate for let's say you're supposed to get $10,000 in a settlement. You'd hate for, because somebody forgot to put a zero in, you only get $1,000 out of it. And so, but if you sign it and just says $1,000, guess what? That's all you're going to get. So one fix for that is to write it out with numbers, but also to write it out with words, because it's pretty easy to drop a zero, 10,000 to 1,000, but it's a little less likely that you would say, just drop the whole word 10,000 or 1,000. It's hard to see how you could type 1,000 when you mean 10,000. So it reduces the likelihood of typos, and so that's why you'll usually see them, in executable documents, numbers written two ways, one with words, one with digits. And by the way, the words usually control if there's a difference between them. Like, let's say in this example, it was 400, but this was 40. Well, then the court would interpret, if there was a question mark, obviously you probably wouldn't be into that situation, but if there was a question mark about whether the settlement agreement really had 40 words or had 400 words, then the 40 would control. Okay, so that is how parentheses works. Don't capitalize the first word in parenthetical expression, even if it would otherwise be a full sentence. And again, you don't want to do that very often because, it's very interruptive for the reader. If the parenthetical is its own independent sentence, in other words, it's not sandwiched in another sentence, then you would use an ordinary punctuation. So you'd capitalize the first letter, you would have terminal punctuation within the parentheses. If it is at the end of a word, like this, in the end of a sentence right here, then you'd put it outside. So the period goes outside the parentheses, because if you put the period inside the parentheses, that would suggest that Friday is a complete sentence. Okay, I'm not going to talk very much at all about dashes, hyphens, and slashes because these are usually considered too informal for legal writing. Well, they're not entirely too informal. Obviously, you're going to hyphenate words that need to be hyphenated. And there will be even times that you will be using slashes. But both of these are a little, DBAs especially, this would be a common one to use. But usually you will not write dates like this. You'll write dates out, with the month, day, comma, and year as a preferred approach. Okay, so for hyphenation of words, you're going to follow the normal rules. You'll just Google the word or have a trusty dusty dictionary handy to figure out, is this a word we hyphenate? Is that word a compound word that needs a hyphen, or is it not? Don't trust yourself, or at least if you're like me, don't trust yourself, because I always get it wrong. And so I always Google it because I know that I'll get it wrong. And so that's a word of advice for you. Now we're going to talk about N dashes versus M dashes. Generally speaking, you're not going to use M dashes a lot in legal writing. It's just a little bit too informal, which is a shame because M dashes are super cool and I happen to love them. If I could get away with using them more, I absolutely would, because I think they're very powerful. They work in many respects like a comma or like the parentheticals, and they have a lot of power. Legal writers sometimes do use them. They are not absolutely verboten under all circumstances. But again, it's a little bit like the quadruple jump off of a diving board. Don't attempt it unless you're, Greg Louganis. You're going to belly flop, and it's going to hurt really, really badly. So it's a high level of skill tool. When you're ready for it, use it. Rarely in legal writing, but you can get away with it. If you aren't, Greg Louganis yet, and few of us, including myself, are the equivalent of Greg Louganis for legal writing. Probably best to step away from the M dash and N dash. Okay, but let's just talk about these, because even though we're not going to use them in legal writing, they do have relevance, especially the N dash for some things that you do need to do. Let me just show you how we're going to use. Actually, well, let's just talk about them generally. To indicate a break or interruption, you can see here, the defendant, not his brother, testified. Absolutely, you could use a comma here instead of the M as in Michael dash. And then certain litigation, the tradition is to use an M dash. Actually, this is just looks like an N dash, to connect those two. Hyphens are just N dashes, as in Nancy, and you will be using those. And you'll be using these between, say, page, I don't know if they have this listed here, between, page numbers, for example. Yeah, here between dates or page numbers or something along those lines. Again, this is all very technical Blue Book stuff. We're not really going to focus on this, but I always like to show people how to make M dashes, because I didn't know for a long time, and it's good information to have. So I'm going to show you the secret. This is not the easiest way to do it, but this is the way I do it. It's a little bit clunky, but for whatever reason, it sticks in my mind. So let's first of all talk about the N dash. Why do we call the N dash, and this is the N dash, an N dash? We call it because it's as wide as the letter N in that particular font. Why do we call the M, as in Michael, dash, the M dash? Well, because it's as wide as the letter M. So mystery solved there. Okay, so how do you make an N as in Nancy dash? Well, all you do is you use, let me go up here. I am just hitting the button next to the 0. Those are all N dashes. Those are also what you use for hyphens. Okay, so this is just a fancy dancy hyphen. How do we make the M as in Mary dash? Okay, well, this is how we do it. We type Mary, or whatever we're typing. We hit the space bar. We do 2 hyphens, that unshifted key next to the 0, another space, and then we type in our word at the end here, and then this is magical, okay? So you can see what I've done. Word, space, hyphen, hyphen, space, word, and now I'm going to hit the space bar. All I'm hitting is the space bar here. Watch this. So cool. Look at that. My 2 N as in Nancy dashes became an M dash as in Michael dash. Okay, now I'm going to go back and remove my spaces, because usually when you're doing an M as in Michael dash, you don't want to have any spaces between those. Even though I've said that we don't use M as in Michael dashes typically in legal writing, there are some Blue Book times where you have to do an M dash, and so it's good to know how to do that. Now you may think to yourself, I'm never going to remember that. Well, guess what? All you have to do is M dash in Word, and it will tell you how to do it. Look, there's 4 different ways of doing it. The way I do it is not the easiest way, but to me it's the most intuitive way. So anyway, that's the secret of the M dash. For this class, you won't need to know that, but since we were talking about it, I thought I would cover it. Okay, let's see if there's anything else we need to cover before we call it a day. The slashes, the backslash, you know how to do that. It's on your keyboard. It is on the same key as your question mark. On the bottom row, 3 keys to the right of the M as in Michael. Again, we won't really be using this in this class, but it can be used, especially if you're writing DBA. We will be doing one DBA or a business along those lines, so you might choose to do that. You don't have to do a backslash DBAs, but anyway, well, let's say you're doing a web address, you're going to be using that particular button. The textbook has some nice exercises to do with respect to all these tools. The index, excuse me, one of the appendices in the book will give you the answer, so you can test yourself to see how you're doing with respect to those. That might be a good investment of your time. And of course, if you have any questions about them, you can't seem to be getting the right answers, or you're not sure why the answer they provide is correct, please come see me. We'll be glad to talk about them in more detail. Thanks for your attention. Have a wonderful day.